So 1 damage is not the same as 1 damage, at least in terms of how much value it can provide, and there are two main reasons that can be the case. I'll go over both of them. They're both kinda counterintuitive, so just stick with me for a little bit. So in order to demonstrate point 1, I want you to just imagine two very simple turn-based JRPGs where your character just attacks. Right. They are basically identical, except for two key differences. In Game 1, our protagonist deals 2 to 10 damage. In Game 2, our protagonist deals 20 to 100 damage, and I'll go over that second difference later because it's not relevant yet. Now, imagine if the games had a 3 to 11 or 21 to 101 range instead, a +1 to damage if you will. That is the same damage boost to each, but it clearly matters more for Game 1. And if that isn't clear to you, just sit and think about it for a little bit. So, for an enemy in Game 1, they're likely going to have less hit points to be balanced around the lower damage. So an enemy with like 7 HP is now getting one-shot significantly more of the time than an enemy in Game 2 would be. So the +1 to damage matters more in the game where you're having either more attacks before the enemy hits you, or enemies have smaller health pools. Even though it's +1 to damage, it matters different amounts depending on exactly the scenario around the +1 damage. And in order to show this, I like to use the percent difference formula, which is right there. And it looks very scary and very mathy, but there's a very easy way to think about it. This stuff down here is the average between the two damage numbers. Simple enough. This is damage number 1, this is damage number 2. So you find the difference between the two, then divide it by the average of the two. Then you multiply that by 100 to get a percent. Simple enough. And what this represents is the amount it changes going back and forth between the two, so you can see the difference between having something and not having something. So, let's look at the percent difference between Game 1 and Game 2. In Game 1, you have 6 because 2, 10, divide by 2, 6. That's how you also get the average of dice rolls because it's a series, blah 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 blah. Not going to get into that mathematical proof. Adding +1 to all those numbers, shifts all of it over, gives you 7. And you can see 15.3446% difference. Simple enough. For number 2, 60, 61, 1.6 blah 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 percent difference. 15 is a lot bigger than 1.6. So the +1 damage more is a much larger increase relative to the smaller damage numbers featured in Game 1. Now, how the hell does this relate to Pathfinder? Well, there are two major types of martials that I like to think about when I'm conceptualizing something. And those are the damage bonus martials and the some other benefit martials. So the damage martials are things like your barbarians and your rogues that have something that's just a bonus to damage on strikes. Swashbuckler, Investigator, Magus because of spell strikes and their stance. All that type of stuff fits under the damage martials. Where other benefit martials are things like the Monk with Flurry of Blows, the Champion with their reaction, the Fighter with their bonus accuracy, the Flurry Ranger with their bonus reduced multi-attack penalty. All those types of things. So you have these two categories of martials. And effectively, on a much lower scale, so there's only like a 1% difference between the percent differences, if that makes any sense. You'll notice that the martial characters that do less damage will get a much larger benefit from things that do a little bit of extra on-hit damage, like, say, a Flaming Rune. And a Flaming Rune very simply does plus 1d6 fire damage on a hit. And it has some other thing on crit, which basically flavor text. Doesn't matter all that much for what I'm talking about. But just having a rune that gives a little bit of extra damage is much more valuable for the classes that do not normally have this damage. Now, this also plays a big role in weapon selection, because classes like the Fighter without damage bonus have a percent difference of around 21% when they choose between a one-handed weapon or a two-handed weapon, which is why you'll see many fighters opt for polearms or greatswords, that way they can be throwing off much larger attacks of opportunity. However, if you're something like a Barbarian, Giant Instinct, which gets a +6 to both of these numbers, well, and suddenly this is a 14, this is a 16, you can calculate that out, and the Giant Instinct Barbarian is only losing about 13% of its damage output to go for a one-handed utility weapon, and they could even take that a step further, go for a shield boss, and they still have the same 20% decrement that the fighter had before, but you now notice that the barbarian has the entire utility of, I now have a shield, which is a massive deal and can offset their lack of AC bulk due to all of the raging that they have going on. So that right there is a great example of a practical way you can apply this to character builds and how you conceptualize things. A second idea, which I dubbed the Sonic the Hedgehog theorem. And that's because a very good example of this theorem is actually Sonic the Hedgehog. And so, Sonic the Hedgehog is a very fun mechanic with its rings. And those of you that played the game probably know where that's going. And it's that the amount of rings you have doesn't actually matter all that much. As long as you have one, you're 2 hits away from death, but you always drop that one ring, you can pick it back up, and you're good. So, in Sonic, it's very rare something will ever do lethal damage to you, and Sonic is just as threatening whether or not he has that ring. So you can, in theory, damage boost the entire game, getting hit thousands of times without losing a single life. Because the only hit point that matters is the last one, and Sonic effectively has infinite HP as long as he has a single ring. Which is ridiculous. But you can also look at that with like another game, like let's say Mario, for example. In a Mario game, you get a mushroom, you can take an extra hit. And then you're going to need to go out, find another mushroom, and do that. But you don't need to reset the stage or go back to a checkpoint unless you fully die. Now, going to pit kills you no matter what power-up you have, but that also means the pits are always doing lethal damage. And you don't need to restart or replay anything unless you take lethal damage. Now, other games that have interesting health systems, Doom. Doom Eternal, like the recent Doom games, they have the glory kill system where you can basically get full health by meleeing a nearly dead enemy. And as such, Doom Guy, his health bar goes all over the place, and he's always threatening no matter what his health bar is, because he can always get right back into the fight by going from that glory kill. Same type of bounce that Ultra Kill does. Ultra Kill has, if you get that parry, you get that damage in melee, you can go back to full health. Health bar again does a lot of bouncing around. And so, in all of these games, you have this idea of damage doesn't really matter until your last hit point, and then you become less scary. And that's even true in some like competitive Pokemon. Because if you have a Swords Dancing Terranormal Dragonite spamming extreme speeds, if you cannot hit that Dragonite before it one-shots your entire team, it does not matter if that Dragon's at 1 HP or 300 HP. It is going to sweep your entire team unless you have a way to stop it from doing that exact thing with a Ghost type or whatever. So, a lot of games are actually built around damage as a thing that ends fights, and few of them actually have a mechanic that has your things become less threatening at low HP. Now, some things Pathfinder are exceptions to this, like some constructs might have damage stay at half HP and blah blah blah, but generally, the only real point damage that matters is the last one. Anything above that is wasted. But let's apply this idea to something far more practical. Let's say you're building a level 1 martial character because your party needs one. And I'll compare different types of weapons and different types of martials to various stat blocks, the 3 being Goblin Warrior, Skeleton Guard, and Zombie Shambler, because I feel these are all very common creatures at low levels play. So, let's start with a fighter. They are choosing between, do I want to use a longsword or a greatsword? And that's their fundamental choice that they are making. So, the fighter, when picking the longsword, is going to have 8.5 damage, with the greatsword 10.5, so the percent difference is 21% for just 2 dice steps of difference on a fighter. But how much does this actually matter? So for Goblin Warrior, it is indeed a roll to kill them in one hit, because they have 6 HP, and fighter has plus 4 strength, so that means on both dice there's one face that does not kill the Goblin Warrior. So 12.5%, the longsword lets it live, where that percent goes down to 1 over 12, because I'm not going to do this math in my head. Just over 8%, the Goblin Warrior gets killed. So that is a significant difference between the two. If we take a look at Skeleton Guard, effectively, due to this resistance here, has 9 HP. So with 9 HP, now suddenly it's coin flip for if the longsword kills, where again, with that greatsword, it is being killed on a roll of 5 or greater, so 7 out of 12 of the faces kill. So 58% of the time the greatsword kills again. Slightly better. So you can see there is a significant difference between the two. Zombie Shambler. Again, this +5 happens at the end, so to do 15 damage in a single hit is impossible for the longsword on a normal hit, but for the greatsword you can do it on a high roll, and if you're critting, that thus has your damage modifier, you effectively only need to get 4 on the dice for either weapon. So, that is something to note. The damage breakpoints do matter a lot for the difference between longsword and greatsword on a fighter. However, let's take a look at what happens for a barbarian. Specifically a giant instinct barbarian, because then I could just simply add 6 to both these numbers. And then we can see what that percent difference looks like. We can see that's only a 13% difference. So the math is saying that it matters not as much. And then we can take a look at the Golem Warrior. Dies via modifier alone. Skeleton Guard dies via modifier alone. Dice don't even matter for these two creatures anymore. You just one-shot both of them. Now, the Zombie Shambler is still a die roll with those two weapons for the Barbarian. However, now the die roll is, in the case because you have the +10 modifier, a roll of 5 or better on a normal hit kills, and crit instantly kills. Basically no matter what. So, again, it doesn't matter as much for them because you need to not crit against the AC 12 creature, which is honestly good job, and then you need to be in a scenario where the roll might actually have a chance to matter. So, you can see that die rolls are not as big of a deal if you already have a large damage bonus, so that will let you go with some weirder weapons if your class has a flat damage bonus built inside of it. So that means Wrestler actually has a lot of funny utility on classes that have flat damage bonuses, such as Rogue, such as something like the Animal Instinct Barbarian, because they're making a lot of strikes that then have bonus effects. So things like Combat Grab and stuff can actually be used by them without them sacrificing a large percent of their damage to use a weirder or suboptimal weapon or fighting style, such as unarmed strikes or whatever. So that's one of the main reasons I really like those types of classes. For Wrestler, it mitigates the downside of needing to use these weaker weapons in order to gain access to this utility. Now back to the hypothetical. The second difference was, of course, that the slimes have different HP. And this means the +1 to damage does a different thing in each game. Even though it's still +1 damage, it changes one die face of the damage roll to be killing. So, why does that matter so much? Well, in game 1, it changes the chance to kill from a something out... Well, it adds 1 out of 9 for your chance to kill, where the other one adds 1 over 81. And 1 over 9 is a bigger number than 1 of 81, so it matters more in game 1, by how it shifts the lethal threshold. And with that, that's the idea of the reasons that 1 damage may not always be 1 damage, and how you should build around that. Totally was an excuse for me to talk about Wrestler again. Also subscribe, I put the channel icon below my webcam. Oh god, the video's ending, the darkness is coming, I will stop existing. Stick around for the next one. Bye.